My name is Neall Raymond Price. I worked in the role-playing game industry for about 15 years. I wrote a lot of stuff for White Wolf. I wrote for Dungeons & Dragons and WotC. I wrote for Paizo. I wrote for Green Ronin. I wrote for a lot of smaller indie companies. I wrote for a lot of folks over the course of my career, about 2 million words worth. And all the time, yeah. I didn't have a personal life because of it. Yay. Anyway, I created a lot of settings in that's my time there. I worked on a lot of established settings. I worked on established IP settings, and I also worked on my own home games, running games that other people had made, running worlds that they did, but also creating a lot of my own. And so what we're here today to talk about is creating your own role-playing game setting and your own kind of tabletop game. So we're going to do some more Q&As with shows of hands. So audience participation is welcome. So how many folks want to create a setting for their D&D game? Okay. That'll make things, that'll cut out a chunk of what I talk about. How many folks have run or played in games other than D&D, using systems other than D&D? All right. So anyone who wants to create it for their D&D setting, want to tell me why you want to use that instead of another system? Sure.
It's the one my friends are most familiar with.
Ah, the classic. Yeah, it is. I don't know if anyone paid attention to some of the news or the discourse, as they call it in tabletop today. There's some stuff coming out about the OGL it's troublesome. But we're not here to talk about the OGL, because what you do at your own damn table is your own business, and they can't copyright mechanics. They can't copyright any of that. So we're going to talk about a couple of high kind of role-playing game concepts before we launch into how to design your own setting for your own RPG and your own table. Can anyone here tell me what a high concept is, or what the high concept specifically of D&D is? You? Anybody? Sure.
It's high fantasy. Magic is everywhere. Magic is available. Magic it's not this thing that nobody gets, but everybody's aware of it. But not everybody can do it.
Okay. It is like that absolutely in a lot of settings. Eberron's a big exception. Let me reframe the question. Does anyone here know what a core gameplay loop is? Yeah.
I have heard the term best described as, all right, what are your characters doing during any one given session of play?
Right. And you'd be shocked at how many people design a setting and design an entire role-playing game and never once think about the core gameplay loop. What are your players doing? What are your characters doing? What is the whole point of them being there? What is the place of them in the setting? Why are they kind of walking through it? To design a role-playing game setting, or to design a role-playing game, whether you're doing mechanics or just prose, or whether you're using an engine that someone's already built for you, you have to take yourself out of the mindset of, oh, I'm creating a world, and think of it as a game. It is a role-playing game. It's not a novel. It's not something there. It's a collaborative exercise and a power you are also giving to the players to help define and play in that world. It's a game, and you need to think of it as a game, and you need to think of it mechanically, as mechanically minded. So I think the first and best advice I can give you for designing a role-playing setting is to actually read the rule book. Like, know what you're doing. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you have to know rules to do it. I'm gonna speak a word, and I want everyone to kind of like internalize this word, and that word is verisimilitude. So verisimilitude, it's the act of seeming real, or the act of feeling real. And whenever you're designing a setting, no matter how wacky, no matter how far out things can get, there has to be a logical reason for it to be there in the setting. There has to be a reason that the things are going on the way they are, and it has to speak to your players, not the characters, your players. Because one of the best examples of verisimilitude I actually ever heard was from the guy who did like the first superhero movie, the granddaddy of them all, Richard Donner, who did the 1970 Superman film with with Superman flying and everything. And he said, at no point can you like see him on wires. At no point can this look fake. It has to look real. And no matter how goofy it is, it has to be kind of taken seriously in that vein. That's not to say that you need to do everything, super seriously. It needs to feel real. And your players need to feel that realness in order to become engaged. So I talked before about the core gameplay loop of D&D. And the core gameplay loop of D&D is this. You go through dungeons, and you kill monsters, and you get magic items. And that's really about it. Like, the D&D engine is really well suited to that. And it's really well suited to doing those things. And to be utterly frank, it's not super great at doing other stuff. Now, a lot of folks and a lot of designers over the years have added other subsystems. They've added other elements to it. Matt Colville, I know, does a lot of stuff about this with like mass combat and stronghold building and those sorts of things. But they are ultimately not part of the core gameplay loop. You're always kind of expected to do those things. Now, that's okay. You can still use it for those other things. You can use it for high romance if you want. There are subsystems for that. You can use it for travel games. There are systems for that. But there's nothing baked into D&D that does those sorts of things out of the box. So when you're designing a setting and when you're designing what you want the core gameplay loop to look like, always remember, if you're using the D&D system and you're playing D&D, even if it's just because that's what your players are familiar with, you have to be aware of what that core gameplay loop is and what you'll have to do stuff outside of that core gameplay loop. Okay, so designing an actual setting. I talked a little bit before about the high concept, and we talked about the high concept of D&D and what a lot of those things are. That doesn't necessarily need to apply to your world. Your world can be a world of romantic adventure. It can be a world of interstellar politics. It can be all kinds of things. It doesn't need to be kicking down doors and dungeons and killing monsters. Although, like I said, because that's D&D's core gameplay loop, there has to be somewhere in there. So let's just kind of go forward with the assumption that that's part of things, that you will be at some point be going into a dungeon of some sort, whether it's a derelict spaceship, whether it's a cavern under the earth, whether it's an imposing fortress, and you're going to be killing something in there. You're going to be doing something in there about that. You'll notice like 80% of the powers in D&D, 80% of the class features are doing something in combat. Sometimes it's give 10 to a deception check outside of combat. Cool, great, thank you. It's the best bard subclass, but I digress. So another show of hands from the crowd. Who wants to do something other than just kicking down doors and killing monsters? But you're using D&D to do it. Okay, that's cool. Someone call out what they want their setting to be like, what they want to design. Just anybody raise a hand. Yes.
Decrepit, falling apart, post-apocalyptic gothic vampires.
Okay. So kind of Vampire Hunter D-ish. Okay. Yes.
As the vampires is my thought, but I will follow the train of thought wherever it goes.
Okay. Okay. Mechs. Oh man. All right.
I don't really have a vision, but I want to make my players do most of the work.
Okay. We have something for all of these things. Yes.
Like a big city, but magic is expensive, so the undercity, they have to switch it up for food elements and the black market.
That's cool. You could probably repurpose a lot of like the Eberron stuff to do that. So first off, I'm going to give you a piece of advice. And that's that, like I said, a lot of third-party folks have already done the work in terms of mechanics and sub-mechanics and stuff like that. They've done it for post-apocalyptic stuff. They've done it for travel games in D&D. They've done it for vampires. and Dompiers, if you want those to be a thing. And so those are absolutely things that you can engage with and things you can steal. Good artists create, great artists steal. That's my one of the best pieces of advice you'll ever hear. So wherever you can steal and wherever you can start making up the difference there, start in on that. So thinking about these, a lot of these core gameplay loops, like you said, you raised your hands, and kicking down doors and killing monsters is not always a part of that. It's not. You can kill stuff in a travel log. You'll probably kill stuff in a post-apocalyptic version or another post-apocalyptic version. One's just a decrepit, decaying gothic horror, and the other one is just probably blasted wasteland, I'm guessing. Okay. And so you have to be thinking about your high concept, your core gameplay loop, and the verisimilitude of what you're doing in terms of the setting. Okay. So actually creating your setting, you have to start thinking about what you want to introduce to your players and what you actually want to have them engage with. You mentioned before that you want your players to do most of the work, and actually that's not a bad idea, no matter what system or setting you're doing. If you have the basic framework and you have what's going on, you can often get your players to really engage with something by just prompting them on what they want their characters to be doing. And this doesn't necessarily mean, what do you do? Because a lot of players are going to freeze up. There's a decision paralysis there. If you tell your players they're doing something, they can be like, okay, I am doing something. You get them there. If you say, you can do anything, what are you doing? People freeze up. All right? So don't say, okay, you're in a new city, what do you do? You have to give them a direction. And I'm going to give you the best piece of direction that I have found in 2 decades of playing games. Food. Some settings you may not have food. Some settings you may be a psychic who subsists off the willpower of others. You may be an amoeba or something who just osmosis food from the environment. Whatever. But assuming that you're playing a D&D setting, assuming that you're playing with the core ancestries, are they called species now? Or are they called? They're not races anymore. What are they? Species?
I would not know, I'm sorry.
That's okay. And the core ancestries, whatever. The core ancestries. Assuming you're going with those, everyone's got to eat. You've got to eat. Your players have to eat. Your characters have to eat. This is a commonality, and like I said, that helps bring in the verisimilitude of what's going on. I also guarantee you that no matter what you're doing, if you're thinking about a culture, if you're thinking about a city, if you're thinking about a place, food is probably the best way, no joke, to actually start thinking about the mechanics of it. Anybody here watch Anthony Bourdain, No Reservations? Yeah, it's on a lot of streaming services. I would highly recommend you go and watch a couple episodes, also because I'm going to give you some advice later that will be helpful for that. Anthony Bourdain very firmly believed, and he espouses this in a number of episodes, that food is the most primal way to understand a culture because it's something that literally all of us need. We all need to do it. No matter what creed, no matter what ancestry, no matter what culture we are originally from, across the world, everybody's got to eat. And you start thinking about what are they eating? How do they eat it? What does their agriculture look like? What do the spices look like? Because the spices mean who are they trading with? Because not a lot of places just have a ton of spices around. They get it from somewhere else. How do they get it? Who are they getting it from? What are they giving in return? Once you start down that path, once you start figuring that out, I guarantee you it all falls into place. And when your players step onto the street or step onto a new city, you describe what they're smelling. Walk down the restaurants section over there. Even though everything's airtight and sealed, you can still smell things. You can smell meat frying. You can smell bread baking. You can smell all kinds of things, stranger things, maybe. If they're eating, 16-legged crustaceans from the ocean, and they're just roasting them over an open fire. That's unique and cool, but yeah, it probably tastes like shrimp, and that's fine. That's something your players can kind of get into. So when you're thinking about that, the prompt of your character's really hungry, what do they want to smell? What do they gravitate towards? What kind of thing are they interested in eating right now? Now, I guarantee you, not a lot of players think about what is their character's favorite food, but little details like that really help to bring a sense of things into play. Does their character like spicy food? Do they like bland food? Do they think mayonnaise with a kick to it is really too much for them? I don't know. So I mentioned Anthony Bourdain, or I mentioned watching No Reservations. I recommend that everyone go there and watch it. And it's very useful for understanding the way that cultures eat food and the way that cultures kind of communally think about the act of eating. So from food, we're going to go on to basic needs. People have needs for sanitation. They have need for water. They have needs for a community. This is a 21 plus event, so I don't think I'm going to blow anyone's mind by saying that the first building that got built in any town in the West was a brothel. And usually attached to a casino, and usually attached to a tavern of some sort. So you got two things taken care of right there. So when you're designing a culture, you have to think about who's inhabiting it and what their basic needs are, and just think, how are they fulfilling those needs, and what are they doing? Now, again, I'm going to go back to the Anthony Bourdain well. You can mix and match cultures from across the world. You can look at the way rice paddies are formed and harvested, and describe that outside the cities that your characters are riding up to. Same thing with wheat fields. Same thing with opium poppies, if you want to. Opium poppies are really beautiful flowers, little red ones, and it's great to see a whole sea of them just outside a city. But that city probably has a drug problem, or they're very medically minded. Who knows? But you see, like when you start thinking about these things, it all starts kind of forming around there. If they have a lot of spices, they're either a port city or they're a major river city. I guarantee you, who here's been to Gen Con? Anyone? Yeah. Gen Con is in the middle of Indianapolis, and every time I go, someone's like, we should go get sushi. And I'm like, we are 500 miles from an ocean. I'm not going to eat sushi here. Anyway, I digress. So you can think about cultures that you want to borrow from, you want to mix and match from, but I do want to bring out a word, and those two words actually. Those two words are cultural appropriation, and it's well and good to look at cultures for inspiration, and it's good to look at elements of it that are private or that can be intimate. But when you do that, you have to make sure that you're not taking something that isn't yours. You have to make sure you're not taking some aspect of that culture that is sacred. If it's something that's shared, if it's something that's talked about, if it's something that is a communal experience, by all means, replicate that, and by all means, feel free to adopt it or adapt it to whatever setting you're making. But you have to be very careful about what you're doing. It's one thing to say, there's a lot of silkworms, or there's a lot of, some sort of animal that generates silk. Maybe they have spiders. I don't know what your fantasy culture is like. And they have, long flowing robes with that sort of thing. But if you can't just say, oh, they're kimonos, and, they're painted in such and such way, it can invite some really unfair comparisons, and more to the point, it can actually introduce some really harmful stereotypes into the minds of your players. And then they'll start reacting to it as if it were, medieval Japan, instead of the place where you actually want it to be and the culture that you actually want it to be engaging with, which is the one that you've created. So when I'm designing different cultures, and I'm designing different settings, I like to think of them as a theme and a mood, and I take that theme and a mood from a certain place, and I take something that it's known for, something the culture's known for, but you don't have to replicate it exactly. Like, for example, in a game called Exalted that I've written for a lot, there is a destroyed culture, and the question kind of came up, like, what was this culture like before it was annihilated? It gets crushed by a giant undead beast. But anyway, they're like, what was it like? And so I had to actually like spin up a little bit of what it was like. And I was like, well, it was a center of learning. And I compared it to Baghdad before the siege of 1258. Baghdad used to be the center of the Islamic Golden Age. It used to have huge universities. It used to have massive libraries. It was a big center of it. And then one of the Khans came by and just absolutely annihilated the place, like razed it to the ground, destroyed the network of irrigation that had kept that place fed and kept that place watered for centuries. And, you know, to be utterly honest, Baghdad never really recovered. 800 years later, and it's, you know, it's a city, and it's a good city with lots of good aspects, but it's not what it was. Yes? That is correct. The population is lower than it was before it was destroyed in 1258. But there's also other centers of learning that you can compare it to. You can compare it to Istanbul and Constantinople and the houses of learning there. You can compare it to Prague under the Premises, especially. Prague had some of the first big universities in Europe. And so, you know, you start thinking of, well, what do I want to actually bring into it? I want to bring that sort of thing. Prague was my sort of entryway, because although some of the superficial aspects of culture I looked at from the Islamic Golden Age, and I wanted to bring into there, and also the centers of learning in Constantinople, I thought, you know, I really want to bring the sort of verisimilitude of Prague in. So again, I looked to food, and I looked at what a lot of Hungarian food looked like. And I got really interested in Hungarian viticulture, or their winemaking industry. Hungary has a really, really interesting wine culture. And like they have a sweet red that's considered to be like the best sweet red in the entire world. I didn't know that, but you know, researching it, I did. And now that is in the game of they used to be very famous for these incredible vineyards that were then destroyed, so that now these bottles of sweet red are the only ones of their type in the world, and they are incredibly rare and valued for that. So, you know, once you start peppering in those little bits into a setting, once you start like plotting out those little tiny aspects of it, you can start kind of bringing it into other parts of the setting and other parts of what you're designing for folks. Okay, we're going to talk about tiers now. I talked about the core gameplay loop. I talked about what you want to bring into the game. I'm going to talk about theme and mood in just a minute, but first I want to talk about scale. And so when I talk about tiers, I like to think of them in a sort of a three-tiered way. And it all relates onto how big you want your game to be and how big you want the game to be for the players. So tier one is kind of just like a neighborhood, a small game. In D&D, it might just be just a village. So you're designing the village, you're designing what it's like, you're designing for maybe a couple hundred people at most, maybe 2 or 3 city blocks. If it's an urban game, maybe just a city district. And you're just thinking about what the local culture there is like and what the local relationships are. And that's easy to do because everyone knows one another. And everyone has some degree of shared culture, even if they're importing stuff from their home culture, even if they moved there, if they were raised there, they have their own sense of things, but they all interrelate and they all interact with one another. There's a mixing that's going on. And for a lot of folks, that's sort of the easiest level to sort of start designing for. Once you start the local place that your players are starting in and your players are interacting with, then you can kind of expand out. When you start thinking tier 2, you start thinking about the scale of what I talked about earlier. You talk about what a city looks like. You talk about what the larger nation state looks like. Where does that village actually exist? Do they have a lord? Do they have a king? Do they have an emperor? Are they part of an empire? Are they on a road to anywhere? Do they have to go down river 3 days to actually get somewhere decent? Actually, I'll catch myself and I'll come back to that for a minute. But you need to think about what the larger area looks like and how it relates to other aspects all around it. What I recommend you do is a post stamp method. If you're going to have your players mostly stay in one village, even if it's just a tier 1, game, think about the tier 2. Think about making like postage stamps of the areas around it, like landmarks or cities or that sort of thing, and you can pepper them into speech. A character can say, "Oh, I came 3 days up from the village downriver," that sort of thing. And if your players are only level 1s exploring the cavern just beyond the ridge there, they know that there's a larger world out there, and eventually they may want to go check it out. Now, I just described it as somewhat decent, and I have to catch myself and kind of remonstrate myself a little bit. I talked a little bit about cultural appropriation earlier, but what I want everyone to start thinking about and what I want everyone to start adjusting in their language is getting rid of a sense of cultural superiority and getting rid of a sense of judgment towards other cultures. You shouldn't be really describing cultures as primitive or as not advanced or as barbaric or that sort of thing. Barbaric is a value judgment. It's a value judgment made by people about people who are not them. Primitive is a value judgment. It's a value judgment made about people who are not them. There's a story about archaeologists finding a little piece of carved bone with 2 holes in it in Stone Age places, Stone Age sites, and they, for the life of them, they couldn't figure out what it was for. And this was sort of a thing that went on over decades and decades of academia. They never knew what these little devices were for, until someone happened to be talking to a leather worker friend of theirs, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's for curing leather. Like it's a way to actually like draw leather through and actually do that." They use a tool. They still use a tool that's very similar to that. And so, we think of these cultures as primitive. We think of them Stone Age. We think of them as that, but they were smart. They had brains the same size as ours. They just didn't have the weight of human history kind of buoying them up. You think of a lot of cultures in southern Asia or sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of folks are like, "Oh, primitive," and they're not. They just have a certain way of living, and they have a culture that's all their own. And so I want everyone to really not think of things in those terms. And it's okay if you slip up. I slipped up. In as much as I forgive myself, I do. But when you're making value judgments about other cultures, try to root it in what the characters are saying, what your non-player characters are saying. If a guy kind of like spits on the ground and says, "Oh, I'm 3 days away from anywhere decent," well, he likes the city and he doesn't like the rural place that he's in right now. That tells you something about the character. It helps you root them a little bit more in the world and about what people of his culture are like and what that's like. So really, again, you're thinking about your setting as a confluence of cultures and a confluence of things that are going on. And you have to think of them, again, in terms of need and in terms of how people fulfill those needs within that area that you're in. So I said that there were 3 tiers, and I'm going to get to the last one. We talked about the postage stamp method, about what's outside the normal village, what's outside the area, and that doesn't necessarily mean a total geographical distinction either. A tier 2 area can encompass an entire city, for example, especially if it's densely populated, like New York. New York is a great example. A tier 1 thing might be a couple blocks in Brooklyn. You might just describe the local culture in there. Although again, avoiding cultural appropriation, you would want, to not maybe like make a fake part of Brooklyn and then just like assign a thing to it. This would be a larger fantasy city that you're creating. A tier 2 game may not even be the entirety of New York City. It may just be one of the boroughs. But more likely it will be the entire city, and you can kind of do the postage stamp method to describe the other boroughs and then flesh those out once the players actually go there. But tier 3 is sort of the national level. It's sort of the larger geopolitical area that this culture and this city and this setting occupies. What's going on in the world outside it? Some settings don't have this. Anyone here played Ravenloft? Yeah. Okay. Curse of Strahd. All right. Yeah. Ravenloft doesn't have a lot outside of those little demi-planes of dread. It doesn't have, massive worlds to explore. It has places to explore and it has things to do, but they're pretty localized by and large. Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition kind of sort of like really emphasized this concept a lot. The default setting was called Nentir Vale. It was never really detailed a lot, and it was described as points of light. There are little pockets of civilization. Again, a bit of a value judgment in there, so be careful with that. There's little pockets of civilization all throughout the place, and your characters are venturing back and forth between them. There's no tier 3 to do. There's no larger geopolitical entity they exist in. Maybe your players will make one. Okay. So we have an hour left or so. Okay. What I'm going to do is we're gonna kind of go through a couple of people's examples and a couple of people's things, and we're gonna workshop it out a little bit so you see how these sort of things can interact and actually go there. Otherwise, I will just talk for another hour, and I can do that, but I don't think you want to hear it. So, who wants to go first? Sure, we can ask questions. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Always remember that the job of a role-playing game and the job of a group together, it's a communal effort to make sure that everyone at the table is having fun. That includes the GM. The GM is another player. You are playing with the game. You are interacting with the game. You need to not think of yourself as separate. You need to think of yourself as another player. Admittedly, you usually are a player with a slightly higher cognitive load and a little bit more of the necessary kind of referee. Some games don't have GMs. Some games and systems completely obviate it. But I've always found even if all of the GMing duties are spread around, or even if nobody has them, this usually falls under one player to kind of keep everyone else herded and keep everyone else on task. And that's the GM's role, especially in the D&D model. So, okay. So how do you do that? How do you think of the core gameplay loop? Like I said, D&D is not super suited to other things outside of what it does really, really well. Kicking down doors and dungeons and hunting monsters and killing things. It does those very well. Again, like I said, 80% of your player character options are your character traits are geared towards killing things or geared towards combat in some way. Only rarely do you have the +10 to deception checks or whatever. So you need to be thinking about how to involve those things, and you need to be thinking about what you're doing. You can import something else from an outside system to do what you want it to do, but think of the high concept and think of the mood and theme that you want. So the gentleman just left, but he wanted the game with vampires, and that's sadly a good example. So you think of the mood that you want to impart to the players from the setting that you're in. And this goes back to the high concept of it. You have a culture, but what do you want the players to feel while they're there? How do you want them to feel? Do you want them to feel like this is a bustling city that doesn't care about them? Especially if they're outsiders, that's part of the mood. Do you want it to feel like a very friendly city, where people are very interested? That's a different mood. Do you want it to feel like it's a false friendly city where the locals are all trying to bilk you? That's yet another mood. So you should be thinking about what you want to do and how you want to involve the players in that. And you want to start looking at the systems that you can engage to further that mood. And more to the point, to get the players to further that mood. I also talked about theme a little bit. And when you're starting in a game and when you're starting to play, you should have something in your mind, if not for the scene that you're in, for at least the session, something that you want to impart to the players and something that you want to communicate to them, the larger thematic point. The systems don't always aid in this, but they can be a help to you if you want. If there's a lot of gladiatorial games or something in a city, but there's very little healing around there, that tells you a little bit about like the bloodthirstiness of the culture. It tells you a little bit about the people and what they value and those sorts of things. It can be a place where, again, you can fall very easily into value judgments, and you should be careful about that. But it can also be very useful to sort of think about how you want to engage things and how you want to impart them in there. Okay, does that help a little bit? Yeah. Sure. Yes.
How have you handled the situation when your players want to explore part of the setting that you didn't develop or didn't work on?
Yeah, that's difficult. So this is a part where having just a couple of postage stamps really comes in handy. Knowing what you want the larger setting to look like and knowing what you have of those postage stamps of this city over yonder is more like Istanbul, this city over yonder is more like France, but this one's more like Paris and this one's more like Lyon. Just having a general idea of what those postage stamps looks like, you can kind of build a web out. And so no matter what area your players wander in, you can kind of think of something. And just as a general GMing thing, if your players do something truly unexpected, don't feel a lot of pressure to be a genius. Don't feel a lot of pressure to just to go through with it. Take your time and say, guys, I genuinely did not expect you to. No, see, guys, I'm making another value judgment. Players, I did not expect you to do that thing. I didn't know that you were going to do that. Give me 5 minutes and I will think of something. And you can spend that 5 minutes blowing into a paper bag. You can spend that 5 minutes frantically Googling. You can do whatever you want with that. You can just sit there and just kind of decompress a little bit. But don't be afraid to engage your players that way. Again, you're another player at the table, and you have to be thinking of it like that. But once you start thinking of the culture, once you start thinking of the needs, once you start thinking of those little elements, and once you have the reason why this place exists and the reason why this culture and this setting exists, things will fall back into place. And you'll find yourself improvising very, very readily. Actually, I did not intend for this to turn into a GMing panel, but I guess that's what it's turning into. So we're going to roll with it like any good GM. Don't force your players to go down a certain route. Don't railroad them, even if they are literally on a railroad in a game. It's no fun for anybody. That said, if your players stubbornly refuse to engage with the high concept, you can take a step back and you can say, players, do you really want to do this? Is this something you want to do? Who here's heard of a session 0? Yay! Last time I did that, only half the room raised their hands. And when I asked that question 3 years ago, nobody raised their hands. So I'm very glad to hear that. That's something that should be brought up in session 0, of agreeing on the high concept, agreeing on the core gameplay loop, what the players want to be doing and their characters want to be doing in there. So, and they say, we want a swashbuckling adventure. You're like, great. The sea captain approaches you and, offers you a place on his crew, and they're like, piss off. You're like, do you really want to be playing this game? That's okay. That's an okay question to ask as a GM. And so, I highly recommend that everyone regardless of what walk of life you're in, regardless of whether you're a GM or a player, go to your local community college and take an improv class. And I guarantee you there's probably an improv troupe somewhere nearby you that does a couple classes. Spend the $35 at some point and just like take a class or two and go through it. It'll give you a lot of skills for improvisation that's useful no matter what you do in any part of your life. But it's especially good for role-playing games because you can just make shit up. We talked a little bit about offloading some of the cognitive load that the GM suffers onto the players. And I talked a little bit about involving a trigger like food into that. But that improvisation also extends to other things. As a GM, you can keep track of the systems that your players are interacting with and that they're constantly engaged with. There's a magic user who's always casting spells or really wants to be doing that a lot in combat. You can have a whole magical culture as part of your city's internal culture. And you could say, as soon as you walk in there, you see someone snake charming with a snake made of flame and shadow or something like that. And it describes the place as a place of high magic first and foremost. Although, again, be careful of stereotypes and cultural appropriation. But, it will capture that player. So when you say to them, you've seen a lot of interesting magic around and you love casting magic in combat, are you going to go hunt for new spells for your spell book? Are you going to try to talk to some of the local mages? Are you going to try to do this or that? You want to find out if there's more of a sorcerer's tradition or more of a wizard tradition here, those sorts of things. And, they can be like, I guarantee you a lot of times players will be like, yeah, I want to find out. And you're like, well, what do you think is here more? And you're like, well, we fought a bunch of, we fought a bunch of elementals outside of the city. So I bet there's a really big sorcerer's tradition here. You're like, great, there is now. You can get, once you get players rolling in those sorts of things, you can have them start defining parts of the setting for you. And again, on the railroading, never get too precious with your plots and never get too precious with your settings. I've had many players, many times come up with something way more brilliant than the thing I had in mind. And I was like, you got it. I'm so proud of you guys for picking up what I was laying down. Yeah, I'm so proud of you. Yeah, no, and just, your players will flesh it out just by virtue of interacting with it. Okay. Are there any other questions before we move on to the workshop portion? Yes. Yes. It's always interesting when that happens. And you learn a lot about intentionality, and you learn a lot about being very cautious about it. So I'll give you the cautionary tale that I had. I was writing for an established IP, Exalted, but I was writing for a section of it that had never really been detailed before, this pocket universe, essentially, with a bunch of nations in it that folks inhabit. And the whole combining cultures thing had already been done a lot in Exalted and other places before. Like, it had already been, there was already a culture that was kind of like Shogunate era Japan. There was already a culture that was kind of like Sparta. And so, we knew there was a warrior culture in this little pocket universe, and that was the only thing we knew about them, warrior culture. And so the mandate I got was, well, don't design something that's like samurais or Sparta. And I was like, okay. I could have gone to a lot of places, but this was 2010, and I thought, well, maybe I'll make them fascist. Maybe I'll just make a fascist culture. In 2023, I would not make that choice. I would absolutely not make this. But back then, 2010, I was like, that'll be cool. So they're kind of Nazis. And I had the unfortunate displeasure of watching over the course of the next decade or so of watching a lot of players get really, really happy about playing that culture. And I was like, God damn it, I have made a terrible mistake. And then I looked on 4chan arguing about the game once, and I was open about having written the game. And some people were mad at me for making it fascist, and some people were mad at me for not making it fascist enough. And I'm like, I don't know which to be more offended by. So the point is that it taught me a valuable lesson about being very careful about the intentionality that you're putting in there. And what I talked about before about theme and mood and what you, the GM, want to communicate to the players and what you want to communicate to folks, and what you want them to engage with. And while you should avoid value judgments, if you write in a fascist culture and you're not super explicit about it being fascist, some players are going to be like, yay, I'm going to get real into that. But that actually is an interesting thing, because later on we were doing some other setting design that took place in the near future, where America has been taken over essentially by a fascist state, the Federated States of America. This is a game called Trinity Continuum. And the Federated States of America have conquered a large part of Mexico and Canada and kind of, made a greater America's like federated states. And they're explicitly fascist. And I was part of the design team for the book that was taking place in a city and then was detailing it. And this was 2021 and not 2010. So a lot of the writers were like, every 1,000 words or so, there was a sidebar about how fascism is bad. And I was like, yes, it is bad. But what I kind of noticed is that a lot of even the writers didn't grasp why it was bad. There's an enormous amount of scholarship that I have since read since 2010 about like the mechanics of fascism and what goes into it, and specifically, why does it appeal to people? Like what do you get out of this? It's maddening, and what do you get out of just like this culture of hating other folks? And there's a really good book called "They Thought They Were Free" about interviewing folks in Germany after the Second World War and being like, why did you support the Nazis? And the author who writes it calls them little people. And for many people, it was for fulfilling like an emotional need, essentially. They just wanted something to do. They wanted to feel part of something. They wanted someone to blame for their issues. Or they were satisfied and happy and had all their needs fulfilled. And so they were like, well, as long as the party's doing that, I don't really care what they do about other people. It's kind of horrifying, but that's like the reason why that sort of thing went through. And so, someone was writing about how, like garish art or garish sorts of things. And I had to, redline their writing. And I said, a fascist culture is the most self-conscious about their social media. They're not always the best at it, but they are the most self-conscious and the most focused on what they're putting out, because they are obsessed with projecting strength. And they are obsessed with projecting an aura of heritage and correctness from the past. And so when I was like, when you're describing the city, you could have a mishmash of like Greco-Roman columns or these sorts of things, but it should be these grand, big things from the past. And it should, look there. There was a big reason why the Nazis had snappy uniforms designed by Hugo Boss, right? Like they wanted to project strength and those sorts of things. So that's an object lesson, and I learned it in 2010, but it did really help in designing future things, because I learned why a lot of those things were, and rather than actually superficially making the setting and not thinking about the high concept and the theme that I actually wanted to impart, I did that, and then some players genuinely got into it, and that kind of horrified me. But when I was, much older and wiser, I was like, well, what are we actually trying to say about this place? What are we actually trying to communicate? What are we saying? And it's that it's painted rust. Like it looks strong. There's no actual strength behind it. So I don't recommend it. it was a mistake to do it, but it taught me a couple valuable lessons. And it's okay to design bad guys in your settings too. It's okay to design areas that are injurious to other cultures, but you both have to be very careful about being respectful to other people, especially at the table, who may have been impacted by those sorts of things or continue to be impacted. And you have to be very careful that you are not making a value judgment, that you are rooting it in the attitudes of the people in the setting and what they are doing, and that you're not replicating accidentally anything that is injurious to players at your table. Again, something that you should discuss during a session 0. Again, things that very robust safety tools should engage with, and that your players should feel comfortable coming to you and being like, I'm not happy with the storyline or how it's going, and something you should be okay with changing. So, yes.
This one's a bit more trivia. I just want to confirm something. You mentioned some of your work with Exalted, including that one city. You described it as a center of learning that was in the current time instead of the show. Was that Thorns? Was that you?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I didn't come up with the original concept, but I came up with everything else about it. So, all right. Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, I'm having this sort of kind of like chicken and egg problem here. I have this idea of creating kind of like this kind of grungy, war-torn fantasy like setting, right? With conflict, right? Creating a conflict that characters are a part of. But when I went to kind of fleshing out like the nation and the characters and stuff, like say you had like the dwarves that live in the mountains over here and the elves that live over here, and I started thinking about their cultures and everything. I was like, they don't have anything to fight with, right? Their cultures are like isolationist by nature. They live in different climates. They don't really fight over the same resources or anything. It's just like how often do you like have this idea that when you start like implementing the setting, you find out these things just don't like match up, right?
Yeah. So first off, I applaud you for starting with the chicken and the egg, because like I said, food is the best way to get people involved with anything. Yeah, that's a problem. And, you have to think about what you want to change about either the cultures that you're detailing or the nations that you're creating, or even the nature of the conflict itself. Did you happen to watch the Lord of the Rings Amazon Prime series? Okay, did anyone here watch it? Okay. I won't spoil it for folks who haven't watched it yet, but they are, it's Tolkien. They are the original dwarves and elves are isolationists, and they find a very compelling reason to be in conflict over it. They're, without spoiling too much on it, there is a resource the dwarves find and treasure that is both immensely valuable to the elves and also comes from an elven source. But the dwarves are like, it's in our lands and we found it. It's ours. And the elves are like, well, it comes from us and also we need it. So give it to us. So what I said before about describing cultures in need, conflict comes from scarcity. It comes from you. It doesn't come from, I don't like your face. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. But usually there's other reasons for it. Usually it's, you have a port that I want. You are getting money that I want. You are getting resources that I want. You guys have access to fresh water and I do not. You have access to other kinds of resources and I don't. So when you think about scarcity and you think about what people can come into conflict over, even isolationist cultures can be drawn into those things because they still need something. Especially if there's a problem that they can't solve themselves, but the solution exists in the other culture. But then when they go to the other culture's like, piss off. And it's like, well, it's time to fight now, bro, because we need that shit. Yes? Yeah. You shouldn't be trading with them. You should be trading with us, and I'll fight you until you do. Yeah, exactly. And, if there's a third human nation, for example, maybe the elves have been, for years, creating artisanal magical items for human elves, and then the dwarves just churn out a bunch of +1 sword shit, and everyone's like, hell yeah, affordable magic swords, and the elves are like, well, they would say Target. It's pronounced Target in Elvish. You first, and then you.
Just kind of following up in the Warhammer Fantasy setting, it's the reason why elves and dwarves are at conflict is more like a cultural thing, where somebody did something to an emissary. I think they like shaved the dwarf's beard, and in shame he comes back to his home and details how he was forcibly shaved, and it caused an entire war between two cultures for a long time.
Okay. But, and this is a value judgment, I've always thought that was a really dumb thing about Warhammer. And I've always thought the grudge thing was dumb. Like, oh no, he shaved his beard. And it's like, what the really? Yeah, they can. But, I played Dragon Age 2, and there's a beardless dwarf in that. And I was like, that dwarf looks damn good. It's like, shit. And so I can't believe that a whole dwarvish culture would never want it. Anyway. There are human cultures who prize facial hair, especially Sikhs, for example. It's offensive to ask them to cut their facial hair or any hair that they have, really. They will sometimes do it if there's an exigent circumstance, but that's a matter of personal preference, and that's a matter of what have you. And to actually shave someone would indeed be incredibly offensive. And if they did it to royalty, that may be cause for a war, because you've just disrespected our entire culture. I don't know how long that war would last. I don't know why, but that might be a very good thing, especially if it had been the first time an olive branch had been extended in many, many years from an isolationist culture. They're like, okay, we'll give the elves a shot. And the elves are like, okay, let's clean you up. Zzz. And they're just like, the first time we do this, you do that. Fuck you. But that also comes back to a scarcity thing. They're looking for respect. They're seeking respect from someone else, and they didn't get it. And instead they got insult. And they want restitution for that. They want to be made whole. And when you start thinking of, tiers 1, tiers 2, tiers 3, you start thinking of what do these places need to be made whole? You'll see where the areas of conflict come in. And you'll see where historical areas of conflict will have come in. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to lead them down a trail, but they don't really care because there's really actually nothing wrong. I don't know how to put it together.
So let's take a step back and let's go back to high concept, theme, and mood. What do you actually want your players to feel out of this? Do you want them to feel, oh man, we should have left this idyllic pastoral nation alone. Now we're douchebags.
Yeah, I want for them to put all the, because like my players are like definitely like evil for sure.
Your players are evil.
Yeah, but they're playing like good characters. I want to get the kids out on the town and then show it to them and say, so the Decepticons.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Okay, that actually makes sense. So you're concerned with the way your players are acting. They're murder hobos, I bet. In case anyone knows that term. Yeah, and you want to be like, these are the consequences of your actions.
They treat people like NPCs, but they're people.
Yes. I applaud your roundabout way of teaching people empathy. But that honestly should be your approach to it, and that should be your theme of I need to teach empathy, or I'm trying to communicate these sorts of things. What I suspect is that although these folks are your friends and you've probably been gaming with them for several years, you are personally not happy with the way they game. And yeah. The first thing I would do is during a session 0, I would say that outright to them. I'd say, you guys, we're treating this as people. They're not quests. They're not NPC quests. They're people inhabiting a little world, and treat them with some empathy and treat them, to enjoy the experience and do those sorts of things. And, start it off just as a player-to-player conversation of this is the experience I'm teaching to you. Don't hide the fact that you're like, if you treat them badly, things will go wrong. Just don't hide that at all. You can deceive the characters, and you can make the characters fight one another. You can do whatever, but doing that to the players is never good. I sometimes go back and forth on whether it's like okay to pass a player a secret message or take a player out to do a scene in another room or something like that. I go back and forth on that because I'm like, well, none of the other players are engaging in the experience. You don't get to see the cutscene of, knowing that sort of thing. You don't get the pathos from it. If a character has a secret sister and then something comes up in play that relates to that sister, and the character's like, oh, well, if the other players don't know that she's a secret sister, they're not going to respond to that. They're just gonna be like, she makes a weird face. Cool. Like, let's kick down a door and kill a monster. So, getting them to engage with that, bringing them into that is really important. I typically allow players to start with like some secrets in their background, but I tell them within 3 sessions, this secret's going to come out to the rest of the party. So you need to think ahead and think of that. So I would start it as, treat your players like adults, which presumably they are. You may run it for an after school group. I don't know. Lots of people do that for D&D. Treat them like adults. Start off by saying, hey, I want you to treat these characters not as like video game NPCs, not as this or that. Like, treat them like people, and there will be consequences if you do not. And have everything stem out from there, and have them, really see the consequences of their actions. If they just, punch a flower girl for offering them flowers too many times, they have to see this girl with this bruise on her face, like wandering around town and being afraid of them. And then angry villagers, because they punched a child. Think about the realistic consequences of their actions and bring it to them, but don't hide that you're doing it. Yes. Yeah.
So you can imagine how most of their interactions went. And I was going to introduce the culture of this town by having them see a shepherd boy beside the road who was going to lead them to the city and do all this. Well, they murdered the shepherd boy thinking he was an enemy.
What?
Yes. To be fair, I did that to them. They were told this city wasn't real, and so when the city was real, they thought, oh my gosh, this is clearly an enemy. And so they tried to hide the body, bury it, do all that stuff. And I was planning, weirdly enough, on having a zombie attack that night. So of course the first zombie, I thought, that should be the shepherd boy.
Oh my God.
He's leading the charge. And it was a really great way to kind of show them the consequences of their actions without, I'm very, especially because I DM for children, without punishing them necessarily.
Yeah.
So I guess just thinking about it that way, like how can you cleverly put their actions into your game without necessarily talking down to them?
Yeah. Always go towards the theme. Always go towards the high concept. The gentleman in the back.
So I have a player on my table who, now that we're around level 4, they're no longer in the setting.
I'm sorry. They're no longer what in the setting?
No longer interested.
I see.
From session 0, we said we're going to do a small gamer campaign, but we're just now getting level 4 and making go. They really haven't given me a backstory to work with. It's a mercenary character, and they just now dropped on me that they don't think their character is super comfortable in going in space.
Okay. Again, always talking to your player like an adult and player to player, and just being outright, and you need to be critically thinking. And if they're not telling you what exactly they need, you need to find a way to draw it out of them. And that goes for a character-to-character interaction. That goes for a player-to-player interaction. So if you ask your player straight out, are you still enjoying the campaign? Do you still want to be in a Spelljammer campaign with the rest of everyone? Do you want to still game with us? And he's like, yeah, but I feel like my character wouldn't do that. And if you go like, well, why not? What does the character feel? What is the character doing? And they're just like, well, I feel like they wouldn't want to go into space. And it's like, well, you can feel free to just kind of openly negotiate with them and be like, would you be okay with your character getting more involved with the Gith out there? Would you feel more comfortable with your character hopping from world to world, or taking mercenary contracts from other worlds, or that sort of thing? Like, how would you want to progress with that? And see what your player says. Just kind of engage with them on that level. It just eventually comes down to the fact that if you're, a lot of bad behavior at a lot of tables has always been excused. Well, my character wouldn't do that. And you can usually cure that by being like, well, why would they not do that? Why would they do this thing? There's a friend of mine also ran D&D for after schoolers. And he actually did a blog about it. And there was a situation that always stuck with me. There was a player whose character was a little barbarian orphan, or not an orphan. He just didn't have any parents. And one day they came to a village, and he met his parents. Like the GM described him meeting his parents, and they're like, "You returned to us," and blah blah. And the player goes, "I activate my battle rage and I kill my parents." And the DM let him do that, and then said, "Why did you do that?" And the player was surprised, and then he thought about it for a second, and he's like, "Because they sold me into slavery, and I had to fight in an arena, and that's why I'm a barbarian." And the DM was like, "My job is done." Because slavery didn't exist in the setting that they were building before. Those sorts of things didn't, but it does now. And that's, again, making your players do the work for it. And just being like, well, why doesn't he? What is your character interested in? What are you interested in? Those are two different questions, but they're both questions you can and should ask. Just like in any kind of relationship, romantic, filial, whatever, 90% of your problems are going to come down to communication. And the other 10% are going to be needs met or unmet that cause conflict. So, just talk to them. That's all I can say. I wish I could give you better advice. I don't know too much about it. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it, but yeah, you and then you.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier how you sort of gone back and forth at times over whether whether it's okay to take one player aside and describe things to them. And it's because I've heard a lot of arguments on the other end of that. Yes, if there's something that only one player's character should know, then only that player should know it, because otherwise, just a lot of people who do not trust their players not to act on information that their characters do not have, but that they do.
Okay, so I get that. I have played with people who have problems with metagaming, who are pathologically incapable of that. All I can say is that I would try to keep that behavior to a minimum. I don't know when this turned from a build your own setting into a GM design thing, but all I can say is that the way I've addressed those sorts of things is I've kept it to a minimum. Sometimes I will talk to a player separately about but then I will always ask them, "Oh, how are you going to bring this up in game? How are you going to communicate this to the rest of the characters?" So that those sorts of things can go through. And then, like, if a player character who shouldn't know that stuff acts on that information, You could just flat out ask them, how does your character know that? How do they do that? Why are they doing that? And they could be like, buh. And it's like, okay. But maybe they will stumble into some sort of genius explanation for it. And you can let them. Like maybe they'll make up a whole new part of the setting of, well, my rogue character is actually part of the city's thieves guild. And of course we know what all the nobles have in terms of treasure because we procured it for them and sold it to them. And it's like, yeah, okay. Like that's a decent answer. And now you've got a whole new section of your setting of, oh, well, the nobles have deep ties to the thieves guild in this. Why do the thieves have a guild? Do they have like competition for other stuff? Is there a standard thief rate? Are you working for off guild rates? What's the healthcare look like in the thieves guild? Surprisingly good. They've got their own cleric of thieves on staff. I think you had your hand up.
How do you handle like on the cuff when your initial design comes into conflict with how like the game is actually running? For like the reason I ask, I come up with this setting, it's like all contained in a city that has been sealed off from the rest of the world for 3,000 years. So as part of like that city currency has kind of denounced itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's all being contained in one spot, at least in my mind, there's not really a point of moving it around. Not to say it doesn't like still have some value, but my players have essentially taken this to mean that everything is free.
Huh.
Not sure how to go about fixing that in a way that like
The city's been sealed off for 3,000 years from like the rest of the world. Where do they put their poop? Ooh. See? And he had an answer right there for it. Good thinking. So, you enjoying that tomato? You're eating my shit. Anyway, yeah, it is what it is. No, first off, I want to actually, joking aside, I'm glad that you had that answer on the ready. I'm glad you were thinking of that, thinking of what it would actually take to make a self-contained city, and thinking of currencies devalued. That kind of society would probably tend towards, either socialist or communist of some stripe, just out of pure necessity. They have no other way to get the items that they need. If someone doesn't like what they're doing there, they can't fuck off. And so they have to have some way of like, or some cultural ethos of everyone chips in, everyone does stuff. Fundamentally, currency is just exchange. It's just a little token that means I have done some sort of labor over here. I've gotten these tokens for it, and now I'm exchanging it for this other labor. That obviously gets really warped when you bring like systems of capitalism into play, and people don't do anything, and they end up with a ton of tokens and whatever. But your players are still kind of existing in that world of, at the very least, this box of treasure shows that they have successfully kicked down a door and killed some monsters. What service that does to anyone, I don't know. It could be a valuable community service. I don't know. But I suspect that, they probably wouldn't have a great currency system. Or they might think of other things as currency, like time, like shift work, for example. And you might be selling shifts, or you might be selling those sorts of things. So they don't necessarily have money as we think of it, but they have a currency, and they have a barter, and they have a system of exchange. And, things aren't free. There's no such thing as a free lunch, even in a poop-fueled hydroponic garden. But you have to think of getting how your players will engage with the system that is there, and get that across to them. Does that make sense? Yeah. Once you communicate to them that no, it's not free, and now they're expecting you to do work for that stuff, like that's an excuse to send them out on an adventure where they get no monetary compensation at the end of it. Just thank you, you've discharged your debt. So. Okay. Yes. If you want to Google anything after this, Google a comic about D&D called Slappy the Barbarian. It's a one-page comic about someone who makes a furbolg barbarian who's raised by clowns, and he's just this furbolg with clown makeup on, throwing banana cream pies. And the DM's like, "You have banana cream pies?" He's like, "I have 12 of them. They're on my sheet." And then it cuts to 40 sessions later, and Slappy is like holding up a collapsing temple, and he's like, "Everyone needs to get out now." And one of the other players is like, "Slappy, he's like, I know. I've always known. Go." I don't know if you're a video gamer at all, but I'm a big fan of the Hitman franchise. And I've always been a fan of the Hitman franchise, even in the PS2 era and going on. The big problem with it tonally is that Hitman's a ridiculous goddamn concept. You are this bold, badass assassin, and you're constantly putting on disguises, and nobody recognizes you. And you're just like going through and you're shooting and doing all these deadly things. There's inherent ridiculousness to the concept. But the most recent trilogy of Hitman games actually recognized that and leaned into it. So it's going to feel weird and it's going to feel counterintuitive, but you should lean a little bit into the silliness and you should lean a little bit into the hilarity, because not only is it entertaining, but you can kind of rabbit season your players a little bit. And by doing that, by leaning in just a little bit, they'll often very much lean the opposite way, and you'll get that Slappy experience of getting them to take things more seriously. We talked a little bit before about the consequences of their actions, and bringing that into play, even as you're leaning into the kind of inherent hilarity of the situation, can really seriously help and can help with that tonal dissonance a little bit. And again, in terms of setting, talking to your players as if they're people. I know they're sometimes not, but talking to them as if they were. You can just be like, "I want this to be a really serious scene. This is going to be, a big romantic scene or something like that. Let's all kind of play it that way and not like crack jokes." Just saying that, just setting the expectation. And then if, a player does crack a bunch of jokes, you can after the session, be like, "That was not cool. Like, we were trying for that and that." Don't embarrass them. That's up to your personal relationship dynamics to figure out the best way to address that sort of thing. But, setting a boundary isn't about saying, do not do this thing. It's saying, if you do this thing, I will do this thing. So it can be, I really want this scene to be romantic and to be serious. If you guys, or, you players, interject or, do something outside of the bounds of that, I'm going to want to talk about it later. Just say that. And then they can't be surprised when it comes up later. Other questions? Yes, sir. Play things that are slice of life town building and steal from them. Play some Harvest Moon. Play some Stardew Valley. There's a really good game that just came out. There's a really good game that came out a month ago called Pentiment. It takes place in 15th century Bavaria. Your player character is one of the last illustrators of illuminated manuscripts for a church abbey before the printing press gets invented and all that goes away, essentially. So they're the ones who draw like the really exquisite drawings in Bibles and those sorts of documents. And there's a murder mystery in it, but what struck me is that every character is there for a reason, and every character has their own very vivid life. There's not a lot of info dumps from the characters. They're not like, well, I was a blah, 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 and the Great War that lasted from blah, 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 blah. There's none of that. But you meet a shepherd who is surprisingly well read in like Latin and like understands some Latin phrases. And you're like, why is a shepherd literate? And second off, why are you, why are you so interested in this? And he's like, well, I was, in the monastery, but then, half my family died, and I had to become a shepherd to support the rest of them. I had to leave and do that. So I learned how to read, but then I left. And when you ask him about why he's so interested in like Roman ruins, for example, he's like, well, shepherding, I go across all the countryside. I see all these Roman ruins everywhere. I'm very interested in them. And here's a little bit about them. And you can ask him about some of the other ruins that you're going to, and he's actually knowledgeable about them. When you're thinking of slice of life, you have to think of the entirety of the atmosphere that you've got and the situation that you've got. But then when you create characters, think about how they are interacting with it and also each other and what they're doing and bouncing around. It's an ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem that functions kind of in stasis until your players come in. My old literature teacher used to tell me that in Western tradition, there's only two kinds of stories. It's either someone leaves home or a stranger comes to town. And when you're thinking of slice of life type things, think of your PCs as either the ones leaving home, and so they're experiencing as much as they can before they leave, or they're the strangers coming to town. And think of it from either of those two angles, and think of it as its own self-contained ecosystem. And I think everything that I talked about before, people have needs. People have various ways of satisfying those needs. Think about how those needs are satisfied in that city and what they do. Because you can't have a slice of life if people aren't actually living, unless they're undead, in which case it's a different kind of game. And then it's like, where do they get the blood from? So, all right. We're coming up on time, I think. But we have 8 minutes. We didn't get to my workshop portion, unfortunately, but I can take other questions if people have them. The best option I would probably talk about is Powered by the Apocalypse. If for nothing else, it's very different, and it teaches you a little bit about how to structure the game. I wouldn't just read one Powered by the Apocalypse book. I would read multiple ones. I'd read Apocalypse World. I'd read Avatar: The Last Airbender, which just came out. I'd read Zombie World, and I'd read. Well, just you can pick a couple others like that. But like Zombie World, for example, is about surviving environmental difficulties, which fundamentally that's what a zombie apocalypse is. The real villains in a zombie movie are not the zombies; they're the environment. The real villains are other people. Your fellow survivors are going to be dicks because scarcity, and because scarcity leads to conflict. But it also has rules for like settlement building and for long-term activities and those sorts of things. The way Powered by the Apocalypse works, I don't know if you're super familiar with it. You are given a list of, like, your players are given essentially sheets that describe their character, and it sort of functions like character classes, but it's a little bit more than that, actually. And they're given a list of moves on those sheets of things they can do in addition to basic moves. The only way that the players interact with the system is through those moves. And it's, what is your character trying to do with that move? So they, if you think of it as like an old style, like, I don't know if you ever played the older Final Fantasy games or those sorts of things, but you had the menu of things to choose from. Your characters have a menu of things. You cannot do anything outside of that menu. And oftentimes you'll find that there's very little that you can do outside of that menu, because if it's a well-written Powered by the Apocalypse game, that menu will be very comprehensive, but also very simple and channel things. Oh, the other one I want to tell you is Mass. Mass is probably, other than the ones I mentioned, probably the best Powered by the Apocalypse game. Mass is about playing teenage superheroes in the Teen Titans and the Young Justice type of mold. It is not a good superhero game because it is not about playing superheroes. It is about playing specifically teen superheroes with superheroics as a metaphor for puberty and for growing out of your teendom and into adulthood. And that's the way the character progression actually goes. So a lot of your powers, a lot of the moves that you do have an unintended consequence or an awkward aspect to them, or you don't quite pull it off very elegantly because you're a gawky, dumbass teenager with superpowers. It's very, or early Spider-Man would be another good like touchstone for it. So it does that very well. And then as you accrue experience in the system, you get to basically correct your moves to the adult version and upgrade them. So you're actually, you've learned your life lesson and you've applied it, and you can now use the adult version of that and do it that way. So I would look at it like that. But once you start thinking of it like that, once you start thinking of your system like that and your setting like that, Powered by the Apocalypse games are really good because they have the high concept of what I was talking about earlier and the mood and theme baked in. They are baked into those sheets. They're baked into those moves of what exactly you're wanting to do. The downside to that, and downside to a lot of PBTA games, is that they don't do other stuff other than what they're exactly fine-tuned to do very well. They're not great toolkits, and they require a lot of work on the part of the designer to actually fine-tune them. But if you want to play a Walking Dead type game about building a settlement and dealing with survivors, if you want to play teen superheroes, it's really good. And it's really good for that. But more to the point, mechanically minded and thinking of things, I'm going to bring it back to what I said at the start of this. It's a role-playing game. You're not writing a novel. You're not, you're not making something just to be thrown out into the world. You're making something to be interacted with by your fellow players, by people at the table. And it's partly a collaborative exercise that you need to engage with. It's a game. And you need to be thinking of it as a game. And I will wrap up with my last pet peeve of a thing. Older D&D was really, really bad at this. But remember what I said at the start of this about verisimilitude, about it needs to feel real in the setting? I will tell you that growing up and reading role-playing games, nothing pissed me off more than like seeing some feat of incredible magic, like a floating castle. I'm like, cool, how did they do that? And it's like, I don't know. And eventually it's like, well, they cast Wish. They got to 9th level and cast Wish. And it's like, what? And it's like, well, can I make a floating castle? And there's no rules for that. Can't do that. And eventually 4E had rituals and stuff that you could do, but that's still just like, well, make up an effect and just roll some dice at it. And it's like, that's very unsatisfying. 5e actually has some stuff in there. Some other like descendants of D&D 3 and 4, like 13th Age, for example, like break things down to utility and have like long-term magical projects as a subsystem that you can engage with. And that's really cool. That actually does make your flying castle. But having read a lot of gaming fiction, having read a lot of gaming settings, I will tell you, nothing is my bigger peeve for me as a designer, besides maybe fascism. Nothing is a bigger peeve for me as a designer as seeing some cool character do something or someone in the past do something that your players can never possibly do as their characters. There's nothing there. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's like if it's a post-apocalyptic story or it's like one of those the past was glorious, but they will never be repeated again. Sometimes that's the theme that you want to communicate, and then it's okay for those sorts of things to never do that. But they should still see the path, right? They should still be like, well, these were built by, these were built by human hands, or they weren't. They were built by aliens. In which case, it's okay for those things to be there. But then you're not like, oh, I'm not being cheated of anything, and my players can never do that. D&D is not very good on the diegetic versus adiegetic mechanical thing about what exists as a feature of the mechanics and what exists as a feature of the character. The storytelling games, like I guess you're familiar with Exalted. Oh. It's okay. So a lot of the White Wolf games have very diegetic sheets, not quite in the Powered by the Apocalypse mode, but in both PBTA and in the storytelling, you can't do anything other than what's on your sheet. Like everything that exists about the character in the world exists on that sheet. And there's no meta mechanics in there. That's like Fate has a fate currency meta mechanic, but that's player to player, not character to character. It's only localized to characters for PBTA and Storyteller. Although PBTA has other meta mechanics, but whatever, not relevant. Once you start thinking about that, once you start thinking about the setting, you have to remember that people built it. Like someone built it, and if it wasn't a person, whether that person is human or elvish or dwarvish or whatever, someone else built it and someone else made it. And if a character does something, either it is a special power or it's something that players should be able to do, whether it's through years of training or whatever, or what have you. Yeah, flying castles and no way to make flying castles, that's bullshit. Yeah, that's classic improv. Yes.
I'm sorry to have deprived you of the opportunity to get to the workshop section. What did it consist of?
I was going to talk to one of you or multiple of you and walk you through building a quick little setting and fleshing out a little bit. Yeah, that would have been cool, but instead you got GM advice. So we're at 7 o'clock. I'm happy to talk to other folks, but I think that there's going to be another panel soonish. So thank you. Happy to talk to folks up here. My name is Neall Price.